All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Relative Search in SSIS. Today's webinar is made possible through a collaborative effort between members of our foster care, SSIS business operations, and permanency units here in the Division of Child Safety and Permanency, and through a partnership with the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy. We would also like to extend gratitude to our often unsung heroes, such as our business analysts, developers, and quality assurance testers at Minute at DHS, who work tirelessly to interpret policy requests and design, develop, and test new functionality in SSIS. What I'm going to attempt to do right now is throw links into the chat that relate to supporting materials to today's presentation. The first one that I'm going to throw into the chat for you is the job aid related to relative search in SSIS. So you'll get that right now. And then we also have the relative search presentation. That I'm throwing into the chat as well. So you should all have the links to the job aid as well as the presentation. This webinar is being recorded. The recording of this webinar and supporting documentation will be posted on the FFPSA page through the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy. And what I'm going to do right now is throw into the chat the website for the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy, where you will find the recording of this webinar at a later time. Okay, so you guys should all have your links available to you in the chat now. And if I could get co-presenters who are on the panel with us today to also repost those links in the middle of the presentation for individuals who might be joining us at a later time. That would be great. So a couple of housekeeping details for our webinar today. You will not be able to unmute yourself as a guest of our webinar, but you can certainly post questions that you might have. Post questions that you might have in what we call our Q&A feature, which you will find in a menu bar at the bottom of your screen. So again, please put questions in the Q&A function, and we will try to provide you with written or verbal response as we move through the webinar today or during the allotted time at the end of our webinar for questions. Kate says that the DHS link doesn't seem to be working. When I turn this presentation over to another presenter, I will try to repost that link for you guys. And again, this presentation is being recorded and we will post it again on that FFPSA page. Today's presenters and panelists are Jessica Broger. She's with the Child and Safety and Permanency Unit here at DHS. She's a child foster care policy specialist. We have with us also Paul Meinhardt, who manages the Education and Training Voucher Program, but he's a jack of all trades, so we like to include him on all of our webinars, and we're happy to have him here to co-present with us. My name is Eric Kratt, and I lead up the SSIS training unit between SSIS Business Operations as well as the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Alicia Wolfman with Child Safety and Permanency, and she's with the Permanency and Quality Assurance team here at DHS. The purpose of this webinar today is to provide an overview as to the importance of the relative search screen or relative search in general. Explore the new screen in SSIS to document relative search and notices, as well as how to use relative search screen to support the assembly and documentation of the QRTP family and permanency team. So relative search, we realize that many agencies might have their own system developed for relative search, but relative search was placed into SSIS for a variety of reasons, FFPSA being the primary vehicle. But this is an opportunity for your agency to keep track of relative search in SSIS. And also, again, to reiterate, this screen was developed for recording family and permanency team that is required for the Qualified Residential Treatment Program assessment as well as placement. And while building it, we kept in mind a broader use. It is not required. However, we're hoping agency workers will find it beneficial and useful. The next section of our presentation, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Paul Meinhardt, who will walk us through the importance of relative search and the benefits to the child.
Thank you, Eric. So, safety, well-being, and permanency are our focus for every child and youth. A relative search helps with these outcomes, and here's how. Children benefit when connected to and reliant upon their family relationships, culture, and community. So I want you just to stop whatever you're doing right now, get comfortable in your chair, and think of a time when you were surrounded by people who shared your cultural identity. Remember how it felt. If it's available to you, think of a time when you were surrounded by people who had a different cultural identity than your own. If you have not had that experience, see if you can imagine it. In which scenario do you feel more relaxed, more comfortable, more safe? Culture feeds our sense of safety. It's how it provides for our well-being. It's why culture matters. Now, parents, both adjudicated and non-adjudicated. Parents, whether biological, step, or adoptive. Parents, either legally recognized or culturally recognized. Parents and relatives provide an entry point into the family relationships, culture, and community for children and youth. Regardless of whether the parent or relative is a suitable placement resource, regardless of whether the parent or relative engages with us, is kind to us, offers to guide us through that entry point. Every parent and relative, even the most difficult parent or relative, can provide children and youth with an entry point into family relationships, culture, and community. And access to family connections, family relationships, culture, and community matter. Now, I think all of us probably can agree that most of what I have said is not helpful, because I'm talking about what's possible, and what's possible may not be happening right now, but the potential is real. The potential is achievable. And when the potential is achieved, it will transform how we approach our work with children, youth, and families. But let's get into more helpful information. Let's talk about how statutes and a new SSIS relative search screen support our work. But before we do, I want to leave you with one more thought. Next slide, Eric. Statutes and SSIS are tools we can use to help us increase a child and a youth's connection and reliance upon family relationships, culture, and community. I ask you to be mindful of how you can use the information and tools discussed in this webinar to transform your work. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thanks, Paul. I always appreciate your kind of vision casting as we're moving forward into the work. I'm going to do a pretty kind of quick overview of relative search in statute. We're not planning to delve deep into policy and practice of relative search today, but we did want to start with some high-level policy info to consider as that feeds into the new relative search documentation opportunity in SSIS. So with that, we'll start really high level with what are the definitions in statute. So as you can see, relative of an Indian child has a different definition in statute than relative. And according to ICWA, the extended family member is defined by a law or custom of the Indian child's tribe, or in the absence of such law or custom, is a person who has reached the age of 18 and who is the Indian child's grandparent, aunt, uncle, brother, sister, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, niece, nephew, first or second cousin, or step-parent. But really wanting to start first and foremost with consultation directly with the tribe and understanding their law and custom around who they would consider a relative. And then the next one, please, is just the Minnesota definition for a relative. And it's broken into two parts. The first being someone who's related to a child by blood, marriage, or adoption, which includes the legal parent, guardian, or custodian of the child's siblings. And then in the second one is an individual who is an important friend with whom the child has resided or had significant contact. So that can include individuals that are often referred to previously as kind of fictive kin. In Minnesota, they do fit into our broad definition of relative by including those important people to the child. So when we're doing the relative search, the next slide kind of has it broken down into two broad categories. And the first one is what people typically kind of traditionally have focused most on is the like looking for a placement resource, whether that's for foster care or possible permanent placement if that becomes necessary. And really the statute also has this huge category of participating in care and planning. And some of the things specifically noted in statute, but not limited to that, would be the case planning, helping to identify strengths and needs of the child and or parents, potentially supervising visits, providing respite and vacation visits for the child. And that does not have to, it is kind of a different piece of statute. It's different than the licensing law. So that doesn't have to be licensed respite in a licensed foster home. That is broader for relatives, and it's part of a case planning decision of what's in the best interest of a child. That does not require the same things of like training and background check, background study. And so that has a lot broader leeway of even someone who, for example, might not be able to be licensed for foster care, such as someone who has a permanent bar to foster care licensure from many, many years ago. If the county's assessment is that they are safe and an important connection to maintain or build for the child, that can include visits up to and including overnights as part of a case planning decision. It can also include providing transportation to appointments, certainly suggesting other relatives who would be helpful and be able to help support the child and parents. And in general, and this one is a huge one, people who can help maintain the child's familiar and regular activities and contacts. And there's a lot of different ways that that can look. So really we want to be thinking in a very comprehensive way, not only of who's included in the relative search, but how they're included and what those opportunities for participation are that are not just limited to placement. With that, the next slide just has a screenshot of a document we published a number of years ago, which is in eDocs, if you look up 7830, it's Children in Foster Care Relative Visitation and Alternative Care Guidelines. So it kind of lays out some of that information of how that can be used, different things to help support children and foster parents. That is separate from and different than the prudent parenting standard, because when it's focused on a need for respite or supervision or childcare, that's not part of the prudent parenting, because the prudent parenting stuff is really focused on the child's developmental needs and normalcy. And so it lays out some of those opportunities. And then the next slide wanted to talk just a little bit more in detail about MIFPA and active efforts. MIFPA is in 260.762, and this specifically is subdivision 3, parents 4 and 5. So it talks about whether the local social service agency notified and consulted with Indian child's extended family members as identified by the child's parents, the tribe, and whether those extended family members were consulted to provide support to the child and parents, to inform the local social service agency and court as to cultural connections, family structure, some of those things that Paul was just talking about, and to assist in identifying appropriate cultural services and support for the child and parents, and identify and serve as placement or permanency resources. And then part of that is also including if there was any difficulty contacting or engaging those family members, whether the assistance was sought from the tribe, the Department of Human Services, and other agencies with expertise in working with Indian families. So I think oftentimes people think of like the active efforts being what's provided directly to the child and parent, and then seeing that this is also applying to potential placement resources and relatives. And so the next one in 5 talks specifically about whether the local social service agency provided services and resources to relatives who are considered the primary placement option for an Indian child, as agreed on by the local social service agency and the tribe, to overcome barriers. That's a big part of it, overcoming barriers to providing care. So those services and resources can include, but are not limited to, child care assistance, financial assistance for the relative, housing resources, other emergency resources, and assistance with foster care licensing and any resources they would need for that. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork that, that there is that higher standard of active efforts and what that might look like to help support family members to both be placement resources and participate in the care and planning for an Indian child. So with that, I will turn it over to Alicia to talk a little bit about the relative search notices.
Thanks, Jessica. We just wanted to quickly go over a couple of tools and resources that we have available that can assist you with the relative search notification process and requirements. Hopefully this isn't a hopefully this is a familiar form. It is eDocs 3799, and this can be used for your initial and ongoing relative search efforts. This template was recently updated in March of 2020, so there may be an older version in SSIS, but the new one is in eDocs, and you can complete it electronically or you can print off the form. What's nice about this is it really hits all of the requirements in 260C.221 with your initial notification. It also has an attachment for a response form for the kinship or relative to complete and send back. So it's a really nice tool both for your agency to document who is notified, you have it in writing, and it also gives an opportunity for those relatives and kin to respond back, kind of like what Jessica had talked about as far as if they're available for placement, but even above and beyond that, as far as case and care planning, how they want to be involved. It's their opportunity to also express and provide information how they would like to be involved. Next slide. As part of the attachment with the 3799, there is a really nice plain language resource that should be sent with that notification, but it's also a standalone document and can be given to families if they want general information. It really breaks down what a relative is, how they can be involved with planning, what their rights are, talks about what placement might look like along with the licensing process, and then what those benefits are. So again, you know, just trying to bring awareness to these resources that we have that can be beneficial and help with the documentation process. The next slide is kind of the third part of this series, and it's the 3799B. And this is your foster care or your relative notification when you're at that permanency. So when you're getting ready to file the permanency petition, this is a nice template that you can send for your permanency notification. Looks pretty similar to the initial, but this one again focuses on that need for a permanent home that the child is likely not returning. And so you're trying to identify those permanency resources. There's also a couple of attachments that you can send along with that. The path to permanency, kinship, and adoption can be sent, which are also standalone documents, but they should be sent with this notification. And again, it was updated in January of 2020. And it's both of these templates are just really nice ways to be able, again, document. We know that relative search is happening, so these resources can be used for you to document in SSIS, and are really good segues to the new SSIS screens. The questions from both the initial notification and permanency, that information will appear similar into the new SSIS relative screens, which is next and why we're all here. So I'll pass it off to Eric, I believe.
All right, thanks everyone. Before we move on to the unveiling, if you will, of the SSIS screen devoted for relative search, I wanted to take an opportunity and just let you know that a few other panelists have joined us today. We have Cynthia Shapolsky, who is the supervisor of our SSIS Business Operations Unit. We also have with us Jennifer Eichten, who is an attorney here with Child Safety and Permanency. And we also have the supervisor for our foster care unit here with Child Safety and Permanency, Deborah Besky Brown. And they are here to sort of help back us up if we are unable to answer any of your amazing questions. Before I launch into the screen, I would also like to address a couple of questions. Kind of going off script here, but Anne asks, when will SSI use the updated forms? And I don't have an answer for you today, Anne, but I am looking into it. I did have a conversation with Alicia prior to this webinar. I don't know if any of our panelists have any indication as to when the forms might, or if there are plans to have the forms updated in SSIS, but I will look into that. Another question that we find in our Q&A right now is, can a non-licensed relative provide care for the child for more than 72 hours? It looks like Jessica's typing an answer, but Jessica, would you like to answer that?
Sure, I'll answer that live with a, it depends type of answer, as per usual, sorry. But the out-of-home placement plan includes the visitation plan for parents, and it specifically denotes in it in 260C.212. Other relatives can be included as part of that. So that's something to consider, is whether or not that would be part of the out-of-home placement plan. And then the relative search statute talks about being involved for, one of the opportunities for participating in care and planning includes respite visits. It doesn't delineate how long that's for. So I think that the 72 hours comes from, the difference in licensing between the short-term and long-term caregiver, substitute caregivers. And also, kind of some of the information from the prudent parenting standard. So those don't directly apply here. So that's really an individualized determination of what's in the best interest of the child. And, we would always say, if you have more questions about that, to really consult with your supervisor and county attorney on, what is really best for this child, and how are you going to make that happen.
Thanks for responding to that, Jessica. I really appreciate it. Now we will move forward into discussing more about the relative search screen in SSIS. You do have links to the PowerPoint available to you, but I have pre-recorded a video so that I didn't miss any opportunities to share important information with you. So I'm going to go ahead and launch into that video. It is about a half an hour long. But it does go into great detail about the different sections that this screen has to offer, as well as how to add participants in a few different ways. And please let me know if you are unable to hear the audio in this video. Relative search in SSIS. The relative search folder is found under a participant's permanency folder. To create a new relative search screen, we're going to select the new relative search in the action menu under the new relative search folder. Relative search includes individuals who are related to the child by blood, marriage, or adoption, including the legal parent, guardian, or custodian, or in some circumstances, the alleged parent. Individuals who are important friends are also included in the relative search, with whom the child has resided with or had significant connection with throughout his or her life. Again, we will select the new relative search action under the relative search folder in the permanency folder. The left-hand side, you can get a bird's eye view of the new relative search screen in SSIS, which can be divided into a couple of different parts. The top part is the parent section equipped with a grid, and the bottom portion of the screen is the relative search information equipped with its own grid. The first section that we will visit in terms of the relative search screen is the parent section. This top portion begins with blue underlined help text that, when selected, will provide a helpful description of the relative search screen. Then we have the relative search begin date field. In this field, we're going to enter date of substantive steps were taken to identify possible relatives. This field is required on save. The next four fields have to do with parent. The parent field allows for entry of up to 4 parents. To select the parent, there must be a relationship link in SSIS of either birth parent, adoptive parent, legal guardian, Indian custodian, or alleged parent. The parent 1 field is required on save. However, this requirement changes when the checkbox next to NA, Safe Place for Newborns Relinquishment, is checked. Additionally, if paternity is not yet established for a child or youth, the relationship should still be entered as a father, as SSIS includes an option to select alleged. SSIS allows for the entry of multiple alleged fathers. Additionally, if a parent has a dual relationship, for example, an aunt that previously accepted a transfer of permanent legal and physical custody of the child and has an additional relationship that can be added to the relationship screen for this child and youth to reflect their parenting status in addition to their previously entered relationship. This will allow them to be selected under the parent section of this screen. And then finally, parents should be cleared in order for them to be pulled into this screen properly. To illustrate the functionality, I'm going to use one of my test clients in the test database for SSIS. I'm going to navigate to Donald Crow's permanency folder. I'm going to expand that permanency folder and navigate to relative search and create an action menu and select new relative search. I'm going to today's date as the date that our agency took substantive steps in locating relatives. And under the parent one field, I'm going to select the drop down, and I'm going to notice that 2 individuals have established relationship in SSIS as either parents, guardians, or custodians, or even alleged parents. In this training scenario, both Jill and Donald the first are the mother and father of this child. For parent 1, I'm going to select Jill. And for parent 2, I'm going to select Donald the first. There is no need to add additional parents in this section for this particular client because this child has 2 established parents and no additional guardians or custodians or alleged parents. Then I'll go ahead and select Save. Now we'll move on to adding relative and kin to the relative search screen. Users will have available to them different ways to add relatives and kin to the relative kin grid. And those ways include selecting participants with established relationships in SSIS from the relative field dropdown, and we'll see an example of that later. Under the relative search information tab, again, we'll see that example later. This dropdown lists available clients, collaterals, already in relationships within intakes or work groups, or on other relative search records for this particular child and youth. Individuals will also have the ability to use quick add existing participants that are already known to the system, again, such as clients and collaterals that are in existing intakes, other work groups, with established relationships to this child and youth, or individuals that are listed on other relative search records for this child or youth. Additionally, existing clients can be added to a relative search screen, and those clients can be located in your agency's database. Finally, individuals that cannot be found as existing participants or existing clients can be added as collaterals. We will see an example of each in the following. The following example is how to add existing participants or collaterals from the relative dropdown. Using our child client, Donald Crow again, I'm going to navigate to the newly created relative search, and I'm going to select relative kin from the action menu and select new relative kin. Notice how a row in the relative grid will appear, and then there's additional information that I need to fill out at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to go ahead and move some of these splitter bars up. And I'm going to add a relative again by selecting them from the drop-down. One thing I want to emphasize throughout this training video is that individuals that you can select from this drop-down are known collaterals and existing participants in work groups with established relationships to this child or individuals that are listed in previously entered relative search screens. From the relative dropdown, I will select Jane Crow. I'm going to indicate the identified date that we found Jane Crow and reached out to her. And then I want to indicate the lineage or connection to this child. And Jane Crow is a grandparent of Donald, and he is the father's mother. So the father up here is listed as parent 2. So I will indicate that there's a lineage or connection with parent 2. And then an additional field will become required in terms of the relationship to the child. And we can go ahead and select grandparent. Now I'll go through the remaining fields underneath the relative search information tab in the near future. But right now, what I'm trying to do is focus on how to enter individual relatives and kins to the relative and kin grid. Now that I have this preliminary and required information entered for this screen, I'll go ahead and save. Once again, this is how to enter an individual from the relative dropdown. Next, we'll focus on the Quick Add Existing Participants functionality for the relative search screen. As a time saver, Quick Add Existing Participants has been added so that we don't have to come in here and enter individual people. That would take several minutes when we can cut that in half by navigating to our relative search folder and selecting the Quick Add Existing Participants function from your action menu. What's going to happen when we select Quick Add Existing Participants is it's going to pull up a grid of individuals who have existing relationships, again, in this work group or other intakes or other work groups in SSIS, or individuals who are associated to another relative search screen that was previously entered, if one should exist. I'm going to just multi-select a few individuals from this grid to highlight its functionality. I'm going to select the control key on my keyboard, and I'm going to select Susan White. I'm going to select John Crow. I'm going to select Jim White. And then I'm going to navigate down to the bottom of the grid and I'm going to select Barney Fife. Once I have all of the individuals selected that I want to add into my relative kin grid, I can select OK. The first informational pop-up that I'm going to see is that 4 participants were processed, 4 relatives added, and 0 already exist as a relative, which basically means they haven't been added to the grid yet. And then I'm going to select OK. The next informational pop-up that I'm going to see is, do you want to continue adding these participants to the relative search? You can select no to cancel out, or in this training example, we can select yes. And then to navigate away from this box, I'm going to hit the red X in the upper right-hand corner of this search field. Once I do that, all of the individuals that I selected should appear in my relative kin grid. So Jane Crow was the first individual that we added using the relative dropdown, but the following individuals that you see in the grid, Jim White, John Crow, Susan White, and Barney Fife, were all added using that Quick Add Participant functionality. One thing I want to note is that even though you've quickly added these participants, the information under the Relative Search Information tab will still need to be completed for each one of these individuals. A third option for adding individuals to the Relative Search grid would be the Add Existing Clients functionality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to the Relative Search folder again. I'm going to select the relative kin, and then I'm going to select New Relative Kin from the action menu. Now that I have this screen up and enabled, I'm going to right-click on Relative Search, Relative Kin, and I'm going to Add Existing Client. Now what's going to happen is a person search box is going to pop up. I'm going to type in another test client that I'd like to add into the relative kin grid that wasn't part of the existing participants, but who is known to our county database. I'm going to type that person's last name in and I'm going to start my search. And the individual that I want to select from the grid is Anna Apple. Once I have her highlighted in the grid, I can hit the select button. And her information should populate under the relative field. And then I would go about completing the remainder of the screen for this particular relative. And then there's a final way to add individuals into the relative kin grid. What we did was we just covered that add existing clients functionality. But if you cannot find an existing client in your database, or you cannot find them as an existing participant with an established relationship to the child or youth, you can add individuals as collaterals to the relative kin grid as well. And we will exhibit that functionality now. So to add an individual that can't be located in your county database or as an existing participant, I'm going to add a collateral by selecting the relative search folder and selecting relative kin, new relative kin. Once I have the new relative information search screen show up, I'm going to navigate back to my relative search folder. I'm going to select relative kin, and then I'm going to select add a new collateral. And that's going to populate a person screen like you would see related to a participant node, where you can enter that collateral's information. So for this particular individual, I'm just going to say John Doe. And the clearing status for this individual is going to be a collateral. And you can enter additional information, as you may know, related to this person on this screen. But this is the only required information you need to enter for a collateral. So I'm going to keep it there, and I'm going to select OK. John Doe's information will populate under the relative field. Again, you're going to want to complete the identified date, the lineage connection, and the relationship to the child, as well as the additional fields as you move throughout this relative search process. Now we're going to focus on the remaining fields that we have not covered yet as they relate to the relative search information tab. Once the worker performs the function of adding the new relative and kin records using one of the 4 different ways that we identified previously, we will fill out the remaining portion of the screen. So I'm going to navigate all the way up to the top of my grid, and I'm going to enter information as related to Jim White. The identified date we're going to use is today's date. And then in that date field, just for clarification, that's the date that the agency became aware of a possible relative. Even if incomplete information was provided, this field is required when saving this portion of the screen. Again, we're going to want to indicate the lineage or connection, and this may be through one parent or more than one parent, or only through the child for certain kinship important relationships. If parents 1 through 4 are not identified in the first section of the screen, workers will not be able to select parents 1, 2, 3, or 4 on the bottom portion of the screen. This information is required on save if there are parents identified above in that parent section. So Jim White is related to parent number 1. Parent number 1, remember, was Jill Crow, which is this child's mother. So we're going to indicate parent 1. And then Jim White is the grandfather, the maternal grandfather to Donald Crow. So under our relationship to child, we're going to select grandparent. Now, if this individual did not have a relationship of grandparent, adult sibling, aunt or uncle, or cousin, we would select other, and then we would need to provide more of a description in the description field next to this relationship to child field. But because the individual is a grandparent, we don't have to fill out anything in this other field. Next, we have the preferred address, the preferred phone number, and the preferred email. we can choose the dropdown, and should we have an address entered for this particular individual, it would appear in the dropdown. However, if we did not have an address entered for Jim, we would not see a selection to be made. We are going to select the 1234 Lake Lane. Preferred phone number, again, functions like the address. If we don't have a phone number added, then we will not see anything in the dropdown. But fortunately for this particular individual, we do have a phone number, and we'll go ahead and select that phone number. And finally, we have that preferred email. Again, that's going to function like the previous two fields, and we'll select the email from the dropdown should we have one entered in SSIS. Then we're going to enter the date the relative was first contacted about participating in case planning. For training purposes, we'll go ahead and enter the 24th. And then we'll want to indicate whether or not this particular relative responded by using the yes or no radio buttons. Then the next question is, or not the question, but statement, label, what have you, is date relative was first notified about the child's need for foster care. So you're going to enter that date using the date picker or manually. And we're going to want to indicate whether or not the relative responded by using the yes or no radio buttons. The next label is the date relative was first notified about the child's need for permanency. Again, you're going to want to enter the applicable date. For training, again, we'll just use the 24th. And again, did the relative respond, yes or no? Then the following fields, relative is interested in caring for the child at this time, yes or no? Relative is interested in receiving notice if a permanent home is needed in the future. Relative would like to participate in care and planning for the child. And relative is requesting notice of court hearings. And then finally, we will want to enter a last updated date. So anytime you enter this screen, you're going to select the last updated screen or the last updated date. And you may return to this screen multiple times as dates and responses from this particular relative come into you at your agency. So again, for training purposes today, we are going to select the 24th, but again, this could change every time you visit this particular screen for this particular relative. Once I have all of this information entered, I can go ahead and save. Again, you will want to do that for each relative that you enter within your relative and kin grid. One additional piece of information related to this section of the screen that I want to draw your attention to is that for each particular individual that you have entered in the relative field, there is a corresponding person information screen that corresponds to that individual and resembles the information that you would find under their participant node. Additional functionality is reflected underneath the relative search folder. You will see that relative search screen that we created using today's date. Additionally, you will see the relative and kin in the tree view listed under that relative/kin folder. And associated with each one of these folders is that client or collateral and their individual address, phone, email, name and race information, as well as education and employment. One thing I would like to point out is that if you do enter a collateral on this particular screen, you'll want to navigate to that collateral information. As you may recall, we entered the collateral John Doe. So you'll want to come in here and you'll want to enter address, phone, and email, name, race information, education, employment, as you would do for clients simply by creating an action menu next to each one of these folder and entering that applicable information. So the use of this screen really is twofold. It is to help agency workers track relatives as per statute for future cases involving out-of-home placement and establishing permanency. And then it also relates to the Family First Prevention Services Act. Should this child ever be a candidate for QRTP placement, and the agency will need to convene a QRTP family and permanency team, the individuals that have been listed on this relative search will be able to be located when creating the family and permanency team screen. And I'll just show you that brief functionality really quick. As you all may recall from the Family First series of webinars, we did go over information about creation of that QRTP family and permanency team. And that is also under your permanency folder. So when you go to create your family and permanency team, you would create that by using the action menu and selecting the new QRTP family and permanency team. You'll want to fill out the required information. If there's no QRTP placement yet, you won't be able to find that in a dropdown. You would have to enter that placement under the placements, locations, and absence folder in order to be able to see it, and it would have to qualify for that QRTP placement. But oftentimes, family and permanency teams will be created when the placement hasn't even been made yet. We'll want to indicate whether ICWA is eligible, or this child is eligible for ICWA and MIFPA. And then when we go to create our participant screen, I just want to show you quickly that the individuals that we've entered in our relative search screen are also present when creating the family and permanency team. So I'll navigate down to my action menu and I'll select new team participant. And without going into too much detail, I'm just going to navigate to this first field for team participant. And when I select the drop-down, I should be able to see all of those individuals, like I said, that have significant relationships already established in SSIS, or those individuals that we added onto the relative search screen. So for instance, Anna Apple doesn't have a significant relationship with Don in SSIS. However, we did bring her in to the relative kin grid on the relative search screen. So therefore, she will now be listed as a potential member of this family and permanency team. Well, I appreciate all of you attending this webinar today and giving me grace, as I often like to process things out loud. And I'd like to thank our panelists, Paul, Jessica, Alicia, Anna, for being here to help get you the links that you need in the chat and answer your important questions. If you do have any lingering questions or think of questions after we end the webinar today, you can always reach out to the foster care unit with this first email handle that you see before you. That will go to their customer relations tool to be evaluated for answer. If you have a question about SSIS functionality, you can reach out to your mentor, and your mentor can email the help desk at ssishelp@state.mn.us. And then for questions related to the permanency unit, adoptions, kinship, etc., you can reach out to northstar.benefits@state.mn.us. Once again, thank you all for taking time out of your busy day. Go forth and conquer, and we will see you back for our next webinar to be announced soon.